I just want to reiterate the same thing that's been said over and over in terms of thanking the organizers and this audience. This has just been phenomenal for me so far. I didn't know Piotrowski, but I've always been aware of his work, and I feel like I'm getting to know him now, which is really finally exciting for me. So I'll jump right into it. In the spring of 2015, the art historian T.J. Clark presented a keynote address at Yale University which sought to investigate the nature of 19th century Romanticism by drawing together the work of three Western European artists. One was French, Theodore Géricault, one was Spanish, Francisco Goya, and one British, William Blake. All are canonical artists, to be sure, but what Clark did with their work was unusual. From the outset of his talk, he drew together these artists via the work they were producing in one single year, 1820. He was seeking to explore the social historical underpinnings that would have led such disparate practitioners to produce what they did in this moment. I'll be honest, he created a fascinating picture of this instant in history. For, as it turns out, this happens to be the year that Géricault was likely painting his portraits of monomaniacs, as they were called, specifically for the head of medicine at Salpêtrière, while Goya was applying oil paint directly to the walls of his house near Madrid, creating works that would later become known as the Black Paintings. And William Blake was plumbing the depths of his metaphysical psyche to produce this little gem in the Tate called The Ghost of a Flea, which could only have come, I think, from this singular mind in a moment that Clark called, quote, the strange new ground of Romanticism. Is the microphone still working? I feel like I can't hear it. Is good? Okay. I was in the audience that evening in April when he delivered this talk, and as it was unfolding, I couldn't help but think of the implications this kind of transcultural thinking could have, but only if carried out on a much larger level. Clark did not address the methodological implications his cluster of paintings might possess, and he did not venture into territory beyond the canon by including artists from other regions. But the talk got me thinking nonetheless. What would have happened if Clark had used his very sophisticated knowledge of political and class histories to expand this cluster? What about, I thought, the bizarre still lifes of Raphael Peale, the ones he was making in Philadelphia in the same year, in 1820? What about the self-portraits made by Orest Kiprinsky while he was in Rome? Alexei Venezianov was also making his gorgeous genre paintings at this time. He was a Moscow native, but by 1820 he had bought a village some 200 kilometers north of the city and was painting pastoral fantasies of serfdom like the one you're seeing on the upper right. While we're at it, I thought, let's throw in another canonical artist, German this time, Caspar David Friedrich. He's working primarily in Dresden at this point. How do his landscapes look in the mix? Does this give us, this thing that my mind was creating, a better picture of Romanticism as a style? Or is this creating something else entirely? As I was sitting there, rewriting Clark's talk in my head as it was unfolding, creating what the art historian Richard Schiff, channeling Benjamin, once called in a different context, constellations, I began to wonder what relation this might have to what Piotrowski called vertical art history, that long dominant and hierarchical system, as we know, that would mean I should in fact reorder these things in my head to look something more like this, making those artists operating in the centers, i.e. you see Paris, Géricault has become ginormous, monstrous here, making them look more like this, such that those artists operating in the centers are huge, while those on the peripheries are kind of tiny by comparison. As we heard yesterday, scale matters. And this constellation reflects, I think, more accurately the ways Piotrowski described the art of the center, determining the paradigm that the rest of the world sought to supposedly imitate and adopt. So is adding Peale and Kiprinsky and Venezianov merely reinforcing the cultural asymmetry so prevalent in the original 1820 moment? Does including them only highlight the ways Russians and Americans in this period failed in their adoption of the supposed romantic vocabulary? I kept thinking about these questions long after this talk, and I kept experimenting. How far, I wondered, can you take such an exercise? How might it create an expansiveness in terms of looking at different media? How might there be other years that might make for even better case studies? I tested out 1915 next to see what a more modernist version might look like. I started by pairing Picasso's Guitar and Newspaper from 1915 with Malevich's Black Square, which looms large in my mind. It was first exhibited in Petrograd that year, 1915. Then I added Egon Schiele to the mix in order to finally start branching out in terms of media by including his prints. In essence, I started feeling guilty about how painting heavy my brain seems to be. But then I thought, oh, what about Mondrian, right? Mondrian is so important. He's working from the Laren Artist Colony in North Holland in 1915. But then I started thinking too, even with all this phenomenal avant-garde abstraction, I remembered that, alas, in New York, where I was living at the time, Ashcan artists, like John Sloan, were still painting works like the Jitney in this year. And come to think of it, and as hard as it is to believe, Monet is still kicking around. He's painting his water lilies in Giverny in 1915, and oh no, Repin, this Russian artist or Ukrainian, was completing a very traditional realist portrait of the actor Pavel Samoylov in Finland at this point, or what is modern-day Finland. No matter how much I added, I could see that the map, and you can see it too, was still not complete. Huge sections of the world and its creative practice are missing from this kind of my attempt at horizontal art history. I tried to think, oh, what can I add from Poznan since I knew I was coming here? But I also thought about Japan, India, Africa, Latin America, but I lack the expertise. Diego Rivera came to mind. Okay, here we go. This is what he was working on in 1915. But then I realized he wasn't in his native Mexico. He was in Paris in this year. This is complicating the map I was creating. Should this image then be placed in the peripheral zone we associate with this artist, or where he actually was? There were other problems too. This map is still too painting heavy, and it's a map made almost entirely of white, masculine privilege. I started to think that maybe this was all, in fact, a failure, that working on what we do would maybe perhaps always result in a kind of failure, that horizontal art history and its acceptance, the thing we so long for, would never come. But certain things did result from these experiments. All this started to make me think differently as a historian. It made me reflect on what we're doing when we try to revive the past, whether it's the 1980s or the 1820s. It made me think about how much one might sink into the period that they're studying. It made me realize the power of the single moment, of all that that thing can contain. And it made me hyper aware of how limited our periodizations according to style really are. I think I actually started to feel a bit like Aby Warburg once did, I imagine, when he was creating this crazy atlas. I had pictures up all over my office. My students thought I had lost my mind as I was trying to cipher these new methods and modes that I thought went against the usual conception of space and time by embracing them all the more dearly. I decided maybe it was time to switch gears. To get out of my own head, so to speak, I started to wonder about the uses of such a transcultural and intrahistorical method, not just in terms of my own research, but in pedagogy. It was at this point that I made the transition to becoming an assistant professor at the University of Louisiana, and I decided there was no better time than then to devise a course, which I did in the fall of 2016, which would reinscribe a sense of the complexity of the Romantic moment in art history. The 19th century is what they had hired me to teach. And I hoped it would be one based, as Piotrowski once wrote, quote, on a pluralistic and non-hierarchical concept of the subject, end quote. I wanted to create a narrative which left what he called the multi-subjectivity of the European dimensions in place, as opposed to flattening them. I called the course, as you can see here from the sort of Moodle website, something we use in the United States, I called the course the Single Year Seminar, and I taught it as an upper-level undergraduate class in art history devoted entirely to creative production in that original year I had been thinking about, 1820. We progressed, and I'm showing you, let me go back. Here we go, a kind of altered, pared-down version of the syllabus. We progressed week by week through all of the artists I've already mentioned, reading deeply on each cultural context and maker. But we also discussed the effectiveness of the method itself, acting as self-conscious producers of historical narratives, analyzing the patterns we saw emerging. I also made the course, as I think you can detect here, deeply interdisciplinary. We read Balzac and Byron and Hegel, and we listened to Beethoven and Schubert, transversing the creative world from Peele's Philadelphia to Friedrich's Dresden to Veneziano's Village. There was no textbook, as you can imagine, just a hodgepodge of readings I gleaned from, in fact, a wide variety of fields. And in the end, we discussed Romanticism as this overarching style of the moment very little. But alas, I wasn't sure that the students were really benefiting from the class. They were enjoying everything, don't get me wrong. They were being exposed to much of this stuff for the first time, including Beethoven's symphonies, which I was horrified by. But they seemed to really feel lost in terms of what they were supposed to be learning. They kept asking me, what am I supposed to be learning? What am I going to be tested on? And I kind of had no answer for this. What they were supposed to be learning and why this was relevant to their lives. I thought maybe I'd just chosen the wrong year, that I should have gone with 1915 after all, or maybe if I'd chosen a year that was more tumultuous in terms of the politics, 1789, 1848, 1917, that they would have derived more benefit from that. But in retrospect, I think the problem went much deeper. The course and the method it explored succeeded in relativizing the history of Western art. It definitely deconstructed traditional geographic categories, and it showed that even the traditional centers of production, Paris, London, Berlin, are and were heterogeneous, deeply so. But it failed in terms of context building, what Norman Bryson has referred to as framing in his discussions of the kind of analytical expertise that art historians bring to bear on art. My course on 1820 was an attempt at horizontal art history in that it figured geography as relational, and it built a historical narrative that was polyphonic and multidimensional, all, as you know, key attributes in Piotrowski's critique of the vertical model. But it failed to be free of geographical hierarchies. Russian and American artists especially still seemed like outliers to the students, even if they liked their work more than that of Géricault and Friedrich. And of course I loved that they liked that stuff so much. I decided at this point to return to the work of Piotrowski and, as many of us do more reading. I knew that I was not the first to critique modernist geographies. Maybe I thought the answers were there in the groundbreaking original scholarship. What I realized first was that there doesn't seem to be a term for the kind of work I was doing beyond this kind of general thing we keep talking about, horizontal art history. Others had undertaken similar projects, but no single term for the method has become established. I usually refer to it as the intrahistorical method, though I think a more accurate expression would be something like, I cringe as I say it, transcultural intervality? I know this is really clunky. Maybe we need to begin devising a new technical language for what we're doing. I thought up the word synchronotechnical, going back to sort of Greek roots. How would this come about? So syn meaning with or same, chronos for time, and techne for art. But do we really need more terms in art history? Piotrowski himself got so close to exploring the kind of practice I'm talking about within horizontal art history, but he only seems to have envisioned it in the context of museum exhibitions, and he never gave it a term. In his 1999 text, Between Place and Time, A Critical Geography of New Central Europe, he issued a call for altered modes of curatorial organization, stating that, quote, one of them could be, for example, a horizontal comparison around particular key dates in both the history of art and in politics. And he proposes 1956, 1968 through 70, 1980. Such critical studies would provide a critical approach to the question of similarities and differences between the center and margins, but also between many geographical margins themselves. He did not explore the idea further, though. Instead, he turned to the dangers inherent in such methods, dangers I had become very familiar with. Most notably, he thought that this method stood to neutralize spatial relations or mask the character of place. There have been, in recent years, exhibitions, I've been keeping a list, with a single year as their focus. A good case in point, the most recent example, would be the Picasso show held at the Tate Modern, which focused on a single year in that master's production. But it, as you may know, was widely panned by critics. Shows like this one tend to reinforce the dominant tendencies of vertical art history and maintain discourses of power as opposed to deconstructing them. Perhaps the best example of the synchronotechnical method can be seen in the textbook Art Since 1900, written by 5 prominent art historians associated with the October Quarterly. The 2-volume study was first published in 2004 and is now in its 2nd edition. Popularly used as the textbook for a range of courses, at least in the United States, Art Since 1900 is arranged by dated entries which proceed chronologically from 1900 to 2010. In the preface, the co-authors explained their system thus. Quote, this book is organized as a succession of important events, each keyed to an appropriate date, and can thus be read as a chronological account of 20th and 21st century art. But, and I like this, like the pieces of a large puzzle that can be transformed into a great variety of images, and we're back to this idea of maps as images, its 122 entries can also be arranged in different ways to suit the particular needs of individual readers, end quote. The authors then explain the range of histories that can be constructed as a result of this organization by single years. One can track narratives constructed along national lines, or alternatively, trace transnational developments, or a third approach would be to group entries according to thematic concerns. According to the authors, the years were chosen because they represent a key moment in the history of 20th and 21st century art. It might be, as they say, the creation of a, quote, groundbreaking work, the publication of a seminal text, the opening of a crucial exhibition, or another significant event. This causes certain years, as you might imagine, to appear in multiple. For instance, there are 2 entries for the years 1900, 1916, 1917, and 1925, to cite but a few. Only occasionally do the authors utilize the single-year format to explore art practice in multiple geographies, though. Piotrowski, again, as you might know, praised this textbook, calling it, quote, definitively one of the best available overviews of 20th century art and an excellent academic textbook, virtually indispensable, end quote. But he also recognized that it was largely focused on Western art and does not revise the tacit assumptions of the modernist artistic geography of the last century. By ignoring the perspective of critical geography and refusing to deconstruct the relations between center and periphery, art since 1900 maintains the status quo hierarchy of vertical art history. Piotrowski admitted that conducting a critique of the vertical program would not be easy, but his hope always remained, throughout his writings, as far as I can tell, that another paradigm might still be established. So, where do we go from here? If art since 1900 failed to create a pluralistic narrative, as did my course on 1820, and exhibitions like the one at the Tate only reinforce homogeneous paradigms, then what is the way forward? In his essay on methods and meaning in modern Eastern European art from 2002, our own Stephen Mansbach argued for a renewed open-mindedness and methodological inventiveness in our field. If we could grasp art within a historically sensitive matrix, he claimed, thank you, got it, then, quote, we might be rewarded with a richer and more complex modernism, end quote. I couldn't agree with you more. But to create such a multivalent geography, I think we must take very seriously our role as teachers, not just researchers, creating the new generation of art historians in our classes right now. We need a textbook that does better than art since 1900, and I think writing one that is truly horizontal will require a team of authors that is not that October group. My map stalled because I am a Russian art specialist who was trained to know the Western European and American canon well. But I needed the mind of a Latin Americanist, an East Asian specialist, an Africanist, someone who works on the Balkans, on Moldova. I need all of this in my brain. We must bond together and create scholarly texts that speak not just to each other like in this room, but to students. And we must make sure these books are affordably priced, and we must use them in the classes we teach. I can imagine a survey. It's glorious, a survey of art history in my mind that would use this new affordable textbook and that relies on the synchronotechnical method that has now a different term, and I have described it here to bring space and time, history and geography together at long last. It would begin, as surveys often do, fine, it's fine, the Renaissance. Let's begin it with Michelangelo's David, okay, but then show this Benin ivory mask from Nigeria, also made in the 16th century. Then discuss Ming Dynasty paintings like this one, and Russian icons, and this remarkable Virgin of Guadalupe, all of these things produced in the same moment in the 16th century. If students who have never taken an art history class get hooked on the idea of horizontal art history from the beginning, if they never even see that old vertical hierarchical model, then we might create a discipline that finally treats all places as equal, that puts the experience of the individual, the local, the personal, and the universal at the forefront. In the end, it's a romantic idea. I know it is. So maybe it was right that I began this thing as a dream I conjured while listening to a talk on Romanticism. No movement was ever more mythical, more characterized by madness, and therefore utterly a thing of modernism. Thank you.